The night sky over Pittsburgh in 1890 did not look like the sky. It looked like a bruise. It was perpetually stained purple and bruised orange by the fires of the Bessemer converters, a man-made hell that churned 24 hours a day. At the center of this inferno stood the Edgar Thomson Steelworks, a cathedral of noise and molten iron. But the man who owned it, Andrew Carnegie, preferred not to smell the sulfur. He preferred the scent of old paper and the quiet adoration of the public. He was a paradox wrapped in tweed, a ruthless monopolist who desperately wanted to be remembered as a saint. He preached the gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich were merely trustees of the poor, yet his fortune was built on the backs of men who burned out by age 40. Here lies the central tension of his life. How does a man reconcile a desire for heaven with a business model rooted in hell? Now, let us open the archives and reveal the shadow behind the success. To understand the tragedy that would unfold at Homestead, we must first dissect the psychological architecture of Andrew Carnegie. He was not a simple robber baron. Unlike Vanderbilt, who famously said, "The public be damned," Carnegie craved the public's love. He wanted to be the benevolent patriarch, the wise philosophical king of the industrial age. He penned essays on the rights of labor and the dignity of the working man. But in the ledger of history, sentiment is a liability. The steel industry was a brutal zero-sum game. To keep prices low and maintain his dominance, wages had to be suppressed and unions had to be broken. Carnegie knew the math, but his ego could not stomach the optics. He needed a mechanism to reconcile his greed with his vanity. He needed a shield. He found one in a man who possessed all of Carnegie's ambition, but none of his need for affection: Henry Clay Frick. If Carnegie was the prophet of steel, Frick was its executioner. By the time they joined forces, Frick had already earned the title of the King of Coke, not the drink, but the coal-based fuel essential for smelting iron. Frick was a man carved from cold marble. In the painted portraits of the era, while Carnegie often appears with a twinkle in his eye, a grandfatherly softness, Frick stares back with a gaze of absolute, unyielding granite. He did not care for libraries. He did not care for the adoration of the masses. He cared only for order, efficiency, and the maximization of the asset. Carnegie brought Frick into his empire not just for his coal reserves, but for his temperament. It was a Faustian bargain of the highest order. Carnegie understood that the coming years would require violence to break the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the strongest trade union in the country. But Carnegie, the friend of the worker, could not be seen holding the truncheon. He needed a proxy. When we peel back the layers of their correspondence, we see the cynical brilliance of this arrangement. Carnegie appointed Frick as chairman of Carnegie Steel in 1889, effectively handing him the keys to the kingdom. This was not an act of delegation. It was an act of moral laundering. By placing Frick in charge of operations, Carnegie created a firewall between his conscience and the cruelty required to sustain his profits. He could demand higher output and lower costs from the safety of his castles in Scotland, knowing full well that Frick would use whatever means necessary to achieve them. Frick, for his part, understood his role perfectly. He was the heavy artillery. He viewed the union not as a group of human beings negotiating for a livelihood, but as an inefficiency, a friction in the machine that needed to be smoothed out. He built fences. He hired guards. He prepared for war with the icy detachment of a general arranging toy soldiers. And Carnegie? Carnegie watched from a distance, cheering on the results while preemptively washing his hands of the methods. The stage was set. The saint had hired his executioner, and the bill for their ambition was about to come due. In the spring of 1892, with the contract expiration looming like a storm front, Andrew Carnegie made his most brilliant tactical maneuver. He disappeared. He boarded a steamer for the United Kingdom, retreating to the lush, rolling silence of his estate in the Scottish Highlands. To the public, it appeared as the leisurely vacation of a semi-retired philanthropist, a man returning to his roots to fish in the locks and tend to his libraries. In reality, it was a calculated abandonment of the bridge. Before he left, he had reviewed Frick's plans for the coming conflict. He had seen the demands for wage cuts, drastic reductions that would cripple the families of Homestead. He had seen the blueprints for the physical fortification of the plant, and he had given his blessing. In a private memorandum, he wrote to Frick, "We approve of anything you do. We are with you to the end." Then, he cut the telegraph lines. He made himself unreachable. He retreated into the heather, creating a vacuum of authority that Frick was all too eager to fill. This was the mechanism of the remote control massacre. By removing himself from the continent, Carnegie ensured that when the blood was inevitably spilled, it would not stain his tweed suits. Back in Pennsylvania, Henry Clay Frick wasted no time. He did not intend to negotiate. He intended to provoke. He encircled the Homestead works with a 3-mile-long fence, topped with barbed wire and punctured by holes at chest height firing ports for rifles. The workers, gazing up at this wooden monstrosity, christened it Fort Frick. It was a declaration of war in pine and steel. On June 29, Frick locked the doors. 3,800 men were barred from their livelihoods. The town of Homestead, which existed solely as an organ of the mill, began to starve. But a lockout requires enforcement. The local sheriff was powerless against a mobilized workforce of thousands, so Frick turned to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. We must pause to strip away the romanticism often attached to this name. The Pinkertons were not detectives in the Sherlock Holmes sense. They were a private paramilitary force, a mercenaries guild for the industrial elite. They were the muscle that Capital hired when the law was too slow or too soft. Frick ordered 300 agents to be deployed, not by train which the workers were watching, but by river, under the cloak of darkness. On the night of July 5, 1892, 2 barges, the Iron Mountain and the Monongahela, were towed up the river, packed with armed agents and crates of Winchester rifles. It was a covert invasion. However, the element of surprise is a fragile thing in a company town. The workers had established a sophisticated intelligence network. As the tugboat sliced through the murky waters, a steam whistle shrieked from the shore, a warning siren that tore through the pre-dawn mist. It was followed by another, and then the church bells of Homestead began to toll. By the time the barges attempted to dock at the mill landing at 4 a.m., thousands of workers and their families had breached the fence and were waiting on the riverbank. The sketches from Harper's Weekly capture this moment with terrifying clarity. A mass of humanity, shadowy and desperate, facing off against the hired guns on the boats. The historical record is hazy on who fired the first shot, a detail that lawyers argue but history ignores. What matters is the eruption. The gap between the barge and the shore became a kill zone. The Pinkertons fired volleys into the crowd. The workers returned fire with revolvers, old muskets, and even a jagged cannon dragged from the town hall. For 12 hours, the Battle of Homestead raged. It was medieval siege warfare fought with industrial tools. Workers poured oil into the river and set it ablaze, attempting to roast the agents in their floating wooden cages. They loaded a rail car with burning lumber and sent it careening down the tracks toward the barges. This was not a labor dispute. It was an insurrection. And where was the prophet of steel? 3,500 miles away, Andrew Carnegie was fishing. Reports of the violence of the 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons dead, of the dozens wounded, of the river running red with blood were flashed across the Atlantic cables. The press besieged his hideaway in Scotland, desperate for a comment from the man who claimed to champion the working class. They found only silence. He refused to speak. He refused to intervene. He allowed the chaos to burn itself out, knowing that the state militia would eventually be called in to crush the Union, which is precisely what happened. The governor of Pennsylvania sent in 8,500 National Guard troops. They marched into Homestead not as peacekeepers, but as an occupying army, securing the mill and handing it back to Frick. The Union was broken. The wages were slashed. The 12-hour workday was reinstated. Frick had won the war. He had taken a bullet in the process, surviving an assassination attempt by anarchist Alexander Berkman just weeks later, which only cemented his resolve. He had done the dirty work. He had crushed the skulls and cleared the floor. But as the smoke cleared over the Monongahela River, a different kind of fracture began to form. It was not in the steel, but in the alliance between the 2 men. Carnegie returned to America not as a conqueror, but as a man frantic to salvage his soul. He looked at the carnage Frick had wrought, carnage he had authorized, and he recoiled. He realized that while the profits were safe, his halo was tarnished. And for a man like Carnegie, that was a price too high to pay. Victory in war is usually followed by a parade. In business, it is often followed by a purge. When the smoke cleared over Homestead, Henry Clay Frick expected gratitude. He had held the line. He had taken the bullets literal and metaphorical, and he had delivered the Union's head on a silver platter. The profits of Carnegie Steel soared in the years following the strike, unburdened by the inefficiencies of organized labor. But Frick made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed Carnegie valued loyalty over legacy. He was wrong. Carnegie looked at Frick and no longer saw a partner. He saw a stain. Frick had become the living embodiment of the violence Carnegie wished to forget, a walking reminder of the blood on the ledger. The unraveling of their alliance was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, corrosive rusting. Carnegie began to undermine Frick, criticizing the very tactics he had silently authorized. He preached peace to the newspapers while pocketing the dividends of war. To a man of Frick's rigid code, this was the ultimate betrayal. Frick was a monster, perhaps, but he was an honest monster. He owned his ruthlessness. Carnegie, in Frick's eyes, was a coward wrapped in a flag of morality. The tension culminated in 1899. Using a technicality in their partnership agreement, the so-called ironclad contract, Carnegie maneuvered to force Frick out of the company, tempting to buy his shares at book value rather than their true market worth. It was a boardroom assassination. Frick, however, was not a starving worker on the riverbank. He was a tycoon with lawyers. He sued Carnegie, exposing the company's astronomical profits to the public for the first time. The saint was revealed to be a hoarder. They settled out of court, making Frick an incredibly wealthy man, but the human bond was severed forever. They spent their final years in New York City, living just blocks apart on Fifth Avenue, yet inhabiting different universes. Carnegie spent the remainder of his life in a frantic race against his own mortality. He began giving his fortune away with a manic intensity, funding over 2,500 libraries, concert halls, and universities. We often view these as acts of generosity, but through the forensic lens, they look more like bribes. Carnegie was trying to purchase absolution. He was building monuments to his name loud enough to drown out the screams from 1,892. Frick, conversely, retreated into a fortress of art. He filled his mansion with old masters Vermeer, Rembrandt, Goya. He sat in silence among the paintings, unrepentant to the end. There is a legend, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, that captures the essence of this blood contract. In 1919, as Carnegie lay on his deathbed, he sent a messenger to Frick, asking to meet one last time to reconcile. Frick, reading the note, looked at the messenger and delivered one of the coldest lines in business history. "Tell him I'll see him in hell, where we are both going." They never spoke again. The saint died hoping for heaven. The executioner died accepting his fate. The steel that Carnegie and Frick forged together still holds up the skeletons of our skyscrapers. The bridges we drive across, the rails that stitch this continent together, they are all tempered in the heat of that partnership. But we must never mistake the monument for the man. Andrew Carnegie proved that you can wash your hands, you can rewrite your biography, and you can plaster your name on every library door in America. But you cannot scour the carbon from the steel. The structure of our modern world was paid for in 1892, and the currency was not dollars. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.